Welcome to the Sixth Age, a medieval history podcast. This is part 2 of our two-part series on the Vandal Kingdom of North Africa. Last time we covered the establishment of the Vandal Kingdom of North Africa and the rise to power of the Vandal king Geiseric. We are starting today's episode in 455 AD, right where we left off last time, with Geiseric having just completed his successful sack of Rome. The historical record gets really confusing after the sack of Rome. While some sources state that Geiseric returned to North Africa immediately after completing his sack, others report that he remained in Italy for several months afterward, carrying out attacks in southern Italy and in Sicily. While I don't know for sure whether Geiseric himself was personally present, it does appear that there was a Vandal force of some type that was carrying on with raids against Roman settlements. The Roman general Ricimer successfully ambushed a Vandal raiding party in Sicily, which may have led to the Vandals' ultimate withdrawal from Italy. Despite the defeat in Sicily, Geiseric ultimately returned triumphant to his North African kingdom, his ships laden with Roman loot. He saw to it the captive Eudocia, daughter of the dead Emperor Valentinian III, was promptly married to his son and heir Huneric. Geiseric's sack of Rome was an unmitigated political and economic victory. At last, he had successfully married his family into the house of Theodosius, and with his new Roman booty, he had the funds to reward his retainers and expand his army. The 6th century historian Procopius did note that one of Geiseric's ships sunk during the voyage back to Africa. Procopius claimed that the ship that sank was full of captured Roman statues, so if anybody ever comes up on a lost ship of Roman statues, let me know. That could be the Vandal ship. At this point, the Western Empire was in disarray. A Gallo-Roman general named Avitus or Avitus, that's a Latin name that I can't pronounce, I'm sorry, we'll call him Avitus, was hastily placed on the Western throne after the Emperor Petronius was murdered by his own people. Avitus, who did not have the support of the Western Roman Senate, faced a rebellion from two of the Western Empire's generals. Ricimer, who was the Magister Militum, we've talked about him before, and another general by the name of Majorian. Within a year, the two rebel generals defeated Avitus, and with a little bit of his political maneuvering, Majorian was ultimately placed on the Western Roman throne, and Ricimer was reconfirmed as Magister Militum. Shortly after Majorian's ascension, Geiseric dispatched a mixed barbarian fleet under the command of his brother-in-law to attack southern Italy. Upon landing, the Vandals were met by Ricimer, who managed to divide the barbarian army and defeat it. Geiseric's brother-in-law, who is unfortunately not named in the historical records, was killed in this battle. However, this was a relatively minor defeat for the Vandals, despite the death of the Vandal general, as the Vandals still had a large fleet anchored in North Africa. The new Western Emperor Majorian was intent on reclaiming the lost provinces of the Western Empire. He bolstered his army with thousands of barbarian mercenaries. Then he invaded Gaul and Hispania to bring the barbarians living there firmly under Roman control. Majorian's ultimate goal was North Africa because he knew that the Western Empire could not survive without direct control of the North African grain trade, and so he planned to launch an invasion of North Africa out of Spain. One of Geiseric's great advantages was his network of informants that he had stationed across the empire. Now, we don't know this for sure, but it does seem likely that Geiseric was able to maintain such a close eye on Roman affairs because he actively cultivated and maintained a pretty big intelligence network. So Geiseric knew that Majorian was ultimately planning to invade Africa, and he took appropriate steps to prevent that invasion. Geiseric stationed troops on Mediterranean islands to slow the advance of Majorian's fleet. The 6th century historian Procopius noted that Geiseric actually had the walls of every city in North Africa except for Carthage torn down. His thinking was that Majorian wouldn't be able to use them as operating bases once he reached Africa. It is also possible that Geiseric feared that the cities, which were still largely populated by Roman citizens, might defect to Majorian. The 6th century historian Procopius argues that while taking down these walls may have been the right move in the short term, it would ultimately be a disastrous strategic decision for the long term, as the lack of walls made it easier for the Eastern Romans to eventually reconquer North Africa in the 6th century. It is worth noting that Geiseric seemed not to be interested in a war with Majorian. He sent the Emperor Majorian multiple peace envoys, all of which were rebuffed. The Roman records accuse these envoys of being insincere, but this feels like typical Roman arrogance to me. It is unlikely that Geiseric would have dispatched multiple rounds of envoys to Majorian unless he really wanted to hammer out a peace deal. Geiseric may have been genuinely afraid that if Majorian landed in North Africa, that he would lose the war. He took drastic measures to hamper a potential Roman invasion. He destroyed city walls, he poisoned wells, and he ultimately banned Nicene Christians from government service. You'll remember that Geiseric, like most of the Vandal elite, was an Arian Christian. Geiseric seemed to be prepared for an all-out, life-and-death guerrilla struggle against Majorian, but Geiseric was nothing if not an opportunist, and when the right opportunity presented itself, he struck. Geiseric's informants reported that the Roman transport fleet was docked in the Spanish city of, and again, I'm going to butcher this, Elche or Elche? I'm going to call it Elche, where it waited for Majorian and his army to arrive. Geiseric ordered a surprise attack by the Vandal navy, and this led to the vast majority of the Roman fleet being destroyed. Geiseric accomplished this feat without heavy losses. It seems that the Roman sailors were inexperienced and unprepared for the Vandal attack. Thanks to Geiseric's intelligence network, because he was able to locate Majorian's fleet and conduct a surprise attack, Majorian lost his transport fleet, and thus the emperor lacked any way to get his army across the Mediterranean Sea. Majorian had almost bankrupted the Western Empire at this point. His army, which was mostly composed of barbarian mercenaries, was incredibly expensive to maintain, and with no fleet to transport his men across the Mediterranean, Majorian simply had nothing for his troops to do, and so he disbanded his army, and he was ultimately forced to conduct yet another humiliating peace deal with Geiseric. Majorian was forced to confirm Geiseric's dominion over North Africa, and he may have even been forced to hand over several other Mediterranean islands to the Vandals, though this is debated by historians. Majorian returned to Italy, having just spent a vast sum of Roman treasure on a failed campaign. Within a few days of his return, the Magister Militum Ricimer imprisoned Majorian and ultimately had him executed. Ricimer successfully gained control of Italy, but the Roman armies in Gaul, Spain, and in Sicily refused to acknowledge Ricimer's command. Majorian had no sons, and thus there was no clear successor to the Western throne. The Eastern Emperor, Leo I, who could have taken advantage of the chaos in the West to seize control of the Western Empire, seemed not to be interested. The Western Empire, after all, was getting to be far more trouble than it was actually worth. Now, Leo should have nominated his own candidate for Western Emperor, but Ricimer ultimately beat him to the punch, and he placed a sufficiently pliable Roman senator by the name of Libius Severus, I think that's Libius Severus, on the throne. Leo, outraged by this, refused to recognize Libius Severus, and thus had little incentive to help the new Western Emperor in his conflicts with the Vandals. Geiseric took the opportunity to further isolate the Eastern Empire from the Western Empire by conducting a separate treaty with Leo. And so we see Geiseric approaching the Eastern Emperor and cutting the Western Empire completely out of the deal. Geiseric sent the wife and daughter of Valentinian III to Constantinople, and in exchange received some of Valentinian's land. Leo also recognized the marriage of Hunneric and Eudocia as legitimate, thus formalizing Geiseric's tie to the house of the Theodosians. Geiseric promised not to attack the East, but he seemed to have made no promises about the West, although he did send envoys to the new emperor Libius Severus, attempting to get him to ratify the earlier treaty Geiseric had signed with Majorian. The Western Roman Senate had no intention of allowing another treaty between the Vandals and the Western Empire. Despite the years of trying and failing to defeat the Vandals, the Western Romans still viewed them as barbarian upstarts who should be destroyed rather than negotiated with. It is shocking that even after the Vandals had sacked the Eternal City of Rome itself, defeated the Romans in countless wars, the Western Romans still refused to treat the Vandals as their political equals. So Geiseric had successfully separated the West and the East, but he could tell that the Western Romans were dragging their feet on a new treaty. In 463, Geiseric resumed hostilities with the Western Romans, claiming to be fighting on behalf of one of his in-laws who had a claim to the Western imperial throne. Geiseric ended the grain shipments to Italy, and he allowed his men to conduct pirate raids across the Mediterranean. He seems to have gotten particularly bold because he had locked down the Eastern Romans. Remember, he has a peace treaty with the Eastern Romans, and the Western Romans were just not in a position to defend themselves without Eastern support. The people of Italy were faced with Vandal piracy, and they may have even suffered a famine. This is debated by historians. The people of Italy therefore tried to force the emperor to make peace with Geiseric, but Geiseric rejected the peace deal, as he seems to have realized that the Western Empire was finally too weak to resist him. Geiseric seized the islands of Corsica and Sardinia, which he added to his growing empire. In 465, the Western Empire was further weakened by the death of the emperor, who apparently died of natural causes. This led to a prolonged interregnum, as Ricimer finally asked the Eastern Emperor Leo to nominate the next Western emperor to the throne. Ricimer did this because he hoped that if Leo appointed the next emperor, then Leo would finally break his peace treaty with the Vandals and help the West fight the Vandals. Unfortunately for Ricimer and the Western Empire, Leo didn't get around to naming a successor for a long time, roughly 2 years. He may have just been too busy with his own internal issues to really find a solid candidate to be the next emperor. In 467, Leo named an officer by the name of Anthemius to the Western imperial throne, and Leo put Anthemius at the head of a massive Eastern Roman army, so no one in Italy would challenge him. Leo sent an embassy to Geiseric warning the Vandal king that unless he withdrew from Italy and Sicily, the Eastern Empire would be forced to join the war. Geiseric refused Leo's terms, and he further refused to recognize Anthemius as the legitimate emperor. Remember, Geiseric is technically a Roman client king, and so it's important that he recognizes that he has that kind of vassal relationship with the emperor. Of course, this is more of a formality than a reality. In effect, Geiseric had decided to take on both the Eastern and Western empires at once, and so the whole Roman world was united in war against him. In 468, Geiseric shifted his focus on from attacking the West to attacking the East. He ordered his pirate fleet to conduct raids on Greek cities in what seems to have been an attempt to get the Eastern Empire to back out of the war. Geiseric may have been trying to prevent the Eastern Romans from organizing their own invasion of North Africa, though we can't know his exact intention. By 468, Geiseric was nearly 80 years old. He had ruled the Vandals for 40 years. During that time, he proved himself time and again as a brilliant strategist and ruler. Again, using his network of informants, Geiseric learned that the Eastern and Western Romans were preparing a joint invasion of North Africa. Geiseric immediately recalled his forces to North Africa, and he began preparing to fend off the Roman invasion. Emperor Leo I was sick of the Vandals at this point, and he wanted them gone, wiped off the face of the earth. By one account, he spent nearly 4 years' worth of imperial revenue preparing an invasion fleet. Historians debate the exact size of the Roman fleet, but it was relatively large, composed of at least 350 ships and manned by at least 7,000 sailors. We don't know how many soldiers accompanied the fleet, but the number is somewhere in the tens of thousands. Leo prepared a three-pronged attack on the Vandals. One army would sail from Alexandria and attack North Africa from the east, while another would sail from Sicily to Carthage. The third army was given the task of attacking Sicily and Sardinia to weaken the Vandal defenses there. The Second Army, which landed just outside Carthage, presented the most immediate threat to the Vandals. Carthage was the home of the Vandal treasury, and if the city was lost, Geiseric would lose the ability to keep his army fed and paid. But Geiseric was a crafty guy. He requested a 5-day armistice with the Romans so he could prepare terms, and the Roman general accepted. Then, Geiseric ordered his men to prepare a surprise attack against the Roman fleet, which the Roman army needed in order to resupply. Using fire ships, which are basically small, decrepit ships that you light on fire and sail into an enemy fleet so that it also catches on fire, the Vandals carried out a devastating attack on the waiting Roman navy, destroying the vast majority of the Romans' ships. Without any way to blockade the city of Carthage's port, the Roman army could not hope to win a siege, and so they were ultimately and humiliatingly forced to withdraw. In a masterstroke, the 80-year-old Vandal king Geiseric had destroyed the Eastern Roman navy and practically bankrupted the Eastern Empire. One of the two remaining Roman armies was forced to withdraw, while the other collapsed due to internal squabbling. Leo may have tried to prepare another invasion, but he was ultimately prevented due to an outbreak of civil war in Italy, where the Magister Militum Ricimer was trying to overthrow Leo's candidate for emperor. This is the same emperor that Ricimer asked Leo to appoint, by the way. Sometime in 471, the Roman princess Eudocia, who was married to the Vandal prince Hunneric, died. This was a political blow for Geiseric, who had lost his familial link to the house of Theodosius. However, Geiseric continued prosecuting his war on the Romans, and it seems that he ordered the resumption of pirate attacks across the Mediterranean. The Romans were far too consumed with their own civil wars to coordinate an effective response, and the Goths, deciding to take advantage of the chaos, invaded northern Italy, thus ensuring that the Western Roman state was way too busy to actually deal with the Vandals. Emperor Leo I died in 474 AD, which meant that the Eastern Empire entered a period of instability. The new Eastern Emperor dispatched an embassy to the Vandals, but Geiseric, who seems to have received advance notice of the embassy's arrival, ordered lightning strikes on coastal Roman settlements so he could seize as much loot as possible before he ultimately signed a peace treaty. Geiseric does seem to have wanted this peace deal, but he realized that if he made these attacks, he could extract maximum concessions from the Romans. Geiseric, who is now in his mid-80s, signed a treaty titled Eternal Peace with the new Eastern Emperor Zeno in 476 AD. 476 was a big year for another reason. You'll remember that that was the year that the barbarian general Odoacer formally deposed the last Western Roman emperor. Odoacer, I've also heard it pronounced Odoacer in some lectures. He seizes control of Italy, and he wished to sign a treaty with Geiseric to secure a lasting peace. Ultimately, Odoacer agreed to pay a tribute to Geiseric, probably to secure the all-important North African grain trade, and he recognized Geiseric's dominion over several Mediterranean islands. In exchange, Geiseric returned Sicily to Italy. He turned Sicily over to Odoacer, and he thus secured a lasting peace between himself and Italy's new barbarian elite. In 477 AD, Geiseric died of old age. He had ruled the Vandals and Alans for nearly 50 years, and through his wars with the Romans, he secured a massive and prosperous kingdom for his people. Geiseric's accomplishments were legendary. He is often considered one of the greatest barbarian kings of the so-called Dark Ages, and it is likely that the Vandal people revered him as the greatest king they had ever known. Unfortunately for the Vandals, Geiseric's son and heir, Hunneric, would not prove to be as effective nor as popular. After the Eternal Peace was signed, the Vandal kingdom entered a period of relative stability that was to last until 530 AD. Hunneric, who does not seem to have been as opportunistic as his father, tried to maintain good relations with the Eastern Romans so as to prevent the outbreak of another war. The Western Empire was, of course, non-existent at this point, and so Hunneric did not have to contend with any Western Roman attempts to reconquer North Africa. Upon his ascension, Hunneric ordered a purge, ordering many of his relatives and potential rivals for the throne either exiled or executed. Huneric, who was about 50 years old at the time of his ascension, was a particularly committed Arian Christian. He ordered several persecutions of Nicene Christians throughout his reign, with a brief break in February of 484 AD. Huneric had several Nicene clergy executed for refusing to convert to Arianism, and according to one account, he maimed other Nicene clergy by cutting off their tongues and hands so they wouldn't be able to pray or give sermons. The main challenge to Huneric's reign was the Berber revolt. The Berbers, who were native to North Africa, had an uneasy alliance with Geiseric, but after Geiseric's death, some of the Berber clans struck out on their own and engaged in a guerrilla campaign to secure their independence from the Vandals. The Berber rebels were skilled in fighting on horseback, and this posed a challenge for the Vandals, who seemed to have preferred fighting on foot. Berber raids would continue on North African towns and cities for decades, and whenever the Vandals did marshal a force to face the Berbers would race away to defensive positions in the North African mountains. One of the books I read for this episode actually compared the Berber insurgency against the Vandals to the tactics used by Algerian rebels against the French in the 1960s. Both the Berbers and the Algerian rebels established their bases in the Orez Mountains, for example. Huneric ultimately recognized the independence of Berber tribes in the mountains, and this seriously weakened his rule as he allowed the Berbers to establish a permanent base less than 2 weeks' ride from the Vandal capital of Carthage. This decision would ultimately prove really dangerous for the Vandal kingdom. Under Huneric, the Vandals began to lose their warlike character. Eastern Roman sources report that the Vandals began to enjoy the fruits of their conquest, and they began to enjoy them maybe a little too much. The children and grandchildren of the original Vandal warriors were raised on vast agricultural estates worked by Roman slaves. By all accounts, they lived luxuriously, though it's possible that our Eastern Roman sources are exaggerating to make the Vandals seem more decadent than they really were. This is also when we start to see the Vandals bringing up their children with classical educations and syncretizing their own culture with the pre-existing Roman culture, although the Vandals did maintain a fierce commitment to Arian Christianity over the Nicene Christianity preferred by the Romans. Huneric's rule was short-lived. The church historian Victor Vitensis, who was a Nicene priest that managed to live through Huneric's anti-Nicene persecutions, reported that Huneric died in 484 AD as a result of a worm infestation. The gruesome death Victor ascribed to Huneric may be exaggerated, as Victor had no love for Huneric and may have wished to humiliate the Arian king in death, or cause people to believe that God had struck Huneric down and given him a particularly brutal death. Huneric was succeeded by his nephew, Gunthamund. Now, Huneric had a son with Princess Eudocia by the name of Hilderic. Hilderic was, however, passed over in the succession, either because Gunthamund was older or because the Vandal elite were suspicious of Hilderic's alleged preference for Nicene Christianity, which he had gained thanks to the influence of his Roman mother. Gunthamund continued to fight the Berbers, although he was ultimately unable to defeat them. Unlike his predecessor, Gunthamund does not appear to have been interested in persecuting Nicene Christians. The end of Huneric's persecutions did bring a level of stability to the Vandal kingdom. It is hard to maintain a stable kingdom when you are actively religiously persecuting the majority of your citizens. There may be some evidence that Gunthamund stabilized the Vandal economy by minting new coins, but the extent to which he was successful in his economic program is debated by historians. There is just a lot less evidence for the reign of Gunthamund than there is for the reigns of his predecessors. Gunthamund ruled for 12 years. I can't find any mention of how he died, so if someone knows, hit me up in the comments. What I do know is that Gunthamund was succeeded by his brother, Thrasimund, which means that Huneric's son, Hilderic, was again passed over for the Vandal throne. Thrasimund is fairly well accounted for in the historical record thanks to the writings of Saint Fulgentius of Ruspa. And Saint Fulgentius was the Nicene Christian bishop of Ruspa in modern-day Tunisia. Fulgentius, who was native to North Africa, presided over the Nicene Christian community there as Thrasimund increasingly persecuted Nicene Christians. Unlike Huneric, Thrasimund's persecutions were largely bloodless. He tended to exile Nicene bishops rather than kill them. Still, Thrasimund was committed to Arian Christianity. Fulgentius depicts Thrasimund as something of a barbarian scholar king. This view is also shared by the Byzantine historian Procopius, who wrote that Thrasimund was, quote, high-minded. Thrasimund, who ruled for 27 years, presided over the high point of the Vandal kingdom. The economy was prosperous under his reign, and apparently Thrasimund secured his position in North Africa by conducting a marriage alliance with the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. And he did this by marrying Theodoric's sister, Amalafrida. Since most of what we know about Thrasimund comes from Fulgentius, let's talk about the relationship between these two. Fulgentius was born in North Africa in the 460s AD. Originally, he was a tax collector for the Vandals, but he later chose to become a monk. As a Nicene monk, however, he was often forced to move from monastery to monastery to avoid anti-Nicene persecutions. His piety was famous, as he was said to live an incredibly ascetic life. Upon reaching his 40s, Fulgentius was considered a top candidate for one of the many vacant bishoprics in North Africa. The bishoprics were vacant, of course, because the Vandal kings kept exiling the Nicene clergy. Originally, Fulgentius chose not to accept a bishopric, as doing so would mean persecution from the Vandals, but he was eventually persuaded to lead the bishopric of Rispa. Of course, taking that position earned him a one-way ticket to exile, and so he was ultimately forced to flee to Sardinia. While in Sardinia, Fulgentius wrote several books for the Vandal king Thrasimund. These books are littered with praise for Thrasimund, which is honestly surprising considering that Fulgentius was only in exile because of Thrasimund, but it's possible that Fulgentius was using flattery to try and advance his position. Through these books, Fulgentius was trying to convince Thrasimund of the truth of Nicene Christianity. Thrasimund was impressed with Fulgentius's arguments, and he ultimately allowed the exiled bishop to return to Carthage in 515. And he did this by sponsoring public debates between Fulgentius and Arian clergy members. Unfortunately for Fulgentius, he seems to have been a little too good at debating, and so the Arian clergy forced Thrasimund to re-exile Fulgentius. Fulgentius was finally allowed to return to North Africa in 523 after Thrasimund had died. Fulgentius himself died of illness in 533, but not before he gave all of his possessions to the poor. Like his predecessors, Thrasimund struggled to conclude a peace with the Berber kingdoms. In fact, towards the end of his reign, Thrasimund's armies suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Berber cavalry. Despite Thrasimund's relative wisdom, he could not stem the Berber onslaught, and this seriously weakened the Vandal state. Thrasimund died in 523, which finally left the Vandal throne open for his cousin Hilderic, the son of Huneric and Eudocia. Upon his ascension, Hilderic ended the anti-Nicene persecutions, and he even allowed the Nicene bishops to return from exile. This brought Hilderic into conflict with the Dowager Queen Amalafrida, who, as an Ostrogoth, was a committed Arian. Amalafrida commanded a personal army of at least 1,000 Gothic warriors, which she bolstered by forming an alliance with some of the Berber rebels. Her goal was to overthrow Hilderic and reinstate Arian Christianity as the official religion of the Vandal state, but she failed. She was defeated, and Hilderic had her imprisoned and then executed. Obviously, Theodoric the Great was not a big fan of this development, but fortunately for Hilderic, Theodoric died before he was able to get a revenge plan together. Hilderic, who was part Roman by descent, pursued friendly relations with the Eastern Roman Empire. Hilderic even had something of a professional friendship with the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian. You're going to want to remember that name. We're going to be talking about Justinian a lot. Very important figure in Eastern Roman history. Hilderic's pro-Nicene policies, combined with his abjuration of the alliance with the Ostrogoths, seriously pissed off many of the Vandal elite, which is why Hilderic's reign is ultimately pretty short. Hilderic lasted for only 7 years before he was overthrown by his cousin Gelimer. Gelimer was an Arian, which may have been why he overthrew his relatively pro-Nicene cousin. Hilderic may have been trying to pass Gelimer over in the line of succession, which, if true, obviously would have pissed Gelimer off. Gelimer imprisoned Hilderic and blinded one of the other claimants to the Vandal throne. The Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian demanded that Gelimer release Hilderic and allow Hilderic to resume his position as king, but Gelimer refused. As Gelimer was technically a Roman client king, Justinian felt that he should have obeyed his commands, and when the commands were not obeyed, Justinian decided to bring an end to the Vandal kingdom once and for all. The ultimate war between the Eastern Romans and the Vandals is unfortunately a topic for a later episode, as I'd like to catch you up on the history of the Eastern Empire up to this point before we dive into the final confrontation. We'll return to the Vandal Kingdom in a few episodes, once I've given you a solid overview of the Eastern Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Emperor who almost reconquered the West. I am, of course, referring to the Emperor Justinian the Great. Thanks for listening to part 2 of my mini-series on the Vandals. As always, you can review my sources on the podcast website, which is linked in the show notes. Feel free to drop comments or questions on the website as well. The series was really heavy on political and military history, so next time I plan to give you a brief palate cleanser with a little bit of religious history. I'll be covering the origins of Christian monasticism, giving you insight into how a mystical theory of Christianity developed in 3rd century Egypt came to be one of the most important religious movements in the history of the world.